The freighter in the fox fur collar said it loud enough for the whole train to hear. "He is plugging a grave with his own wagon." Someone behind him laughed, a thin sound that carried a long way in cold air. Women looked away. A boy repeated the phrase until his mother pulled him back inside the canvas. Below the trail, between two granite boulders the size of a freight shed, a man was doing something that looked like madness. He had stripped a wagon box off its broken gear, harnessed two exhausted horses to it, and was dragging the bare pine shells sideways into a crack in the rock. He did not look up. He measured the gap again, called to the horses, and pulled. October 19th, 1868. The western shoulder of South Pass, Wyoming Territory, where the continental divide spread so wide and flat that most travelers crossed it without knowing they had reached the roof of the continent. Abram Vail knew. He had studied the maps in Ohio, traced the route with a carpenter's pencil on butcher paper, while Martha nursed Jonas through croup, and Ruth asked why they had to leave the only house she remembered. He knew the pass was broad. He knew the grade was gentle. What he had not known, what no map sold in Cincinnati had bothered to mark, was that gentle and broad also meant open. Open to wind that had nothing between it and the Arctic but grass. The wagon was too heavy. He had known that since Fort Laramie, where two men with a scale and a talent for bad news told him he was carrying 400 pounds more than his team could sustain over the divide. Abram had nodded and changed nothing, because the 400 pounds were his tools. 2 augers, a broad axe, a short axe, 3 iron straps, a spoke shave, a draw knife, a chest of chisels and planes and clamps that smelled like the shop he had lost in Zanesville when the creditor's notice came and the sheriff's deputy would not look him in the eye. Those tools were not cargo. They were the reason for the crossing. Without them, Abram Vail was a 38-year-old man with blistered hands and a family he could not feed. With them, he was a wheelwright and wagon repairman headed for the Sweetwater mines, where broken axles and split felloes were as common as gold dust and twice as profitable. Martha sat on the driver's bench beside him, one hand braced against the wagon bow, the other pressed flat against her ribs where the summer fever had settled and never quite left. She was 34 years old and had not complained once since Independence, Missouri, which worried Abram more than if she had screamed every mile. Quiet Martha meant calculating Martha, and calculating Martha meant she had already done the figures in her head and found them wanting. Behind the bench, under what remained of the canvas cover, the left side had torn on a snag outside Devil's Gate and been patched with flour sacking that let in rain. Ruth and Jonas rode with the cargo. Ruth was 10 and handled herself like 12. She kept Jonas occupied, kept the flour barrel upright when the wagon lurched, and kept a running inventory of every item that shifted, broke, or went missing. Jonas was 5. He coughed when the air turned cold and asked questions no one could answer. Why did the sky look like that? Why did the horses breathe smoke? Why did the ground sound different here? Levi Pike walked beside the left rear wheel because Abram could not afford the weight of a 5th body on the bench. Levi was 15, thin as a fence rail, and had been with them since the Platte River crossing, where Abram had found him sitting on a trunk beside a fresh grave. Levi's uncle had died of cholera. The trunk held nothing but a change of clothes and a letter from a woman in Illinois who turned out to be dead too. Abram had offered him wages he could not pay and work he could not guarantee, and Levi had climbed down from the trunk and started walking west without looking back at the grave. They had $6.70 in coin, a small keg of flour, maybe 40 pounds, a half sack of beans, 2 sides of salt pork, one already showing green at the edges, a coffee tin with enough for perhaps 10 mornings, a cracked Dutch oven that worked if you seated it just right on the coals, 28 pounds of oats for 2 horses that needed 60, one short axe, one broad axe, two augers, three iron straps, one coil of hemp rope, 40 feet, fraying at both ends, and the chest. Always the chest. $6.70 against a debt note due in South Pass City before first hard freeze. A note that said Abram Vale owed $31 for passage credit extended at Fort Bridger, and that if the note was not met by the date written, the creditor could claim any property Abram carried as collateral. The tools were collateral. The wagon was collateral. The horses were collateral. Everything Abram owned existed at the pleasure of a man named Milton Greaves, whom Abram had never met, and who operated a freight office near the mines. That was the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was already bad before the axle broke. The trail descended a shelf of frozen mud between outcrops of granite that punched through the thin soil like knuckles. The right rear wheel found a stone rut that the wheels ahead had somehow missed. The iron axle caught, torqued, and snapped behind the bolster with a sound like a rifle shot. The wagon dropped. Jonas hit the flour barrel hard enough to split the stave. Martha grabbed the bow with both hands. Ruth screamed once, sharp and short, and then went silent, which was worse. The horses lurched forward against dead weight, felt it, and stopped. One of them, the bay, the better of the two, turned its head and looked back at Abram with an expression he would remember for the rest of his life. Flat resignation. The animal knew before Abram did. He climbed down and walked to the rear. Levi was already on his knees in the mud, staring at the brake. The iron axle had split clean behind the bolster plate, a fracture so sharp the metal looked like it had been cut. Black iron, cold brittle, stressed past endurance by 400 extra pounds dragged over 1,000 miles of rut and rock. Abram knelt beside it and felt the edge of the brake with his thumb. Clean and cold. No saving it. No splinting iron that had crystallized from fatigue. He needed a forge, an anvil, a spare axle bar, or 3 men with a block and tackle and a replacement rig. He had none of these things. Ruth appeared beside the broken wheel. She held a tin cup under the hub where grease dripped from the shattered bearing housing, catching it because waste was something the family could not afford even now, even with the axle in 2 pieces and the wagon dying under them. Her fingers were blue around the cup. She did not say a word. She just caught the grease. That was when Captain Reuben Haskell rode back. Haskell was 62 years old, built like a fence post wrapped in leather, and had crossed the pass 4 times as a wagon master, and twice before that as an army teamster hauling supplies to the Utah garrisons. He wore authority the way other men wore coats. It was simply on him, and no one questioned it. The 31 wagons behind Abram's broken rig were Haskell's responsibility, and Haskell took responsibility the way a minister took scripture, literally, personally, and without negotiation. He dismounted, walked to the axle, crouched, and examined the brake for less than 10 seconds. "Iron's crystallized," Haskell said. "Stress fracture. You've been running heavy since Bridger." "I know," Abram said. "You need a forge, a spare bar, 3 men in rigging. You have none of it." "I know." Haskell stood. He looked at Martha on the bench, at Ruth with her tin cup, at Jonas peering over the wagon side with snot running from his nose and his chest making a sound like a squirrel in a box. He looked at the sky, which had turned the color of old pewter and was dropping lower by the hour. "South Pass City is a hard day's ride for a man on a good horse in fair weather," Haskell said. "Your wife cannot walk it. Your boy cannot walk it. You cannot carry him and lead 2 horses and haul tools over 12 miles of open ground in what is coming." He pointed west where the sky met the ridge in a line so flat and gray it looked like the world ended there. "I have seen that sky before," Haskell said. "You have maybe 36 hours before it hits. Maybe less. When it hits, it does not stop for 3 days, sometimes 5. Abram said nothing. He was still kneeling beside the axle. "I cannot risk 30 people for one wagon," Haskell said. "I have children in my train. I have a woman past her 7th month. I have livestock that will not survive an extra night in the open." He let the silence hold. Then he said the words Abram already knew were coming. "You have 3 choices. Abandon the wagon and distribute your family among the other rigs. Leave the tools and take what you can carry. Or stay here beside it and take your chances." "If I abandon the tools, the debt note takes everything else," Abram said. "If you stay, the cold takes everything, including you." "There has to be another way." "There is no other way. I have crossed this pass 6 times. Men who stay beside broken wagons in October do not cross a 7th time." Haskell mounted his horse. He did not say goodbye. He said, "The train moves at sundown. If your family is on another wagon by then, they ride. If not, God help you, because I cannot." He rode forward without turning. Martha climbed down from the bench. She walked to Abram and stood beside him, both of them staring at the broken axle as if looking at it long enough would change the iron. "The note," she said. "I know. Without the tools, you are not a repairman. Without repair work, we cannot eat through winter. We will arrive in South Pass City with nothing but the clothes and the children, and we will beg from the same men who are laughing at us right now." She was not arguing. She was doing what Martha always did. She was stating the mathematics until the answer became visible. Abram looked past her at the boulder field. Granite outcrops, some of them the size of small buildings, scattered across the slope like toys dropped by a giant child. Between them, lodgepole pine grew in sparse clusters, twisted by wind into shapes that looked like hands reaching for something they could not hold. The ground between the boulders was a mix of frozen mud, loose scree, and patches of old snow that had never melted from the shadows. A miserable place, a place no one would choose to stop. Then Jonas did the thing that saved them. He coughed twice, hard, the kind of wet bark that made Martha's face go tight, and he climbed down from the wagon bed and disappeared behind the nearest boulder. Martha called his name. Abram was already moving, expecting to find the boy hurt, expecting to find him crying against cold stone. He found Jonas crouched in a narrow cleft between 2 immense granite boulders. The child had wedged himself into the gap the way children do, instinctively seeking shelter, finding the one place where the wind could not reach him. His hair was dusted with ice crystals. His coat was soaked. But the candle stub he had taken from the wagon, the stub Martha used to check the flour barrel at night, was burning in his cupped hands, and the flame stood nearly straight. Outside the cleft, wind tore smoke sideways from the scattered campfires of Haskell's train. Inside, the flame barely moved. Abram knelt in the opening and pressed his palm against the stone wall. Cold, yes, but dry. Dry where the wind could not reach it. He pressed his other hand against the wagon's wooden side panel, then lifted both hands into the open wind above the boulder line. Stone, wood, wind. 3 different temperatures, 3 different rates of heat loss. He remembered his father's cellar in Zanesville. Elias Vale had repaired lime kilns for a living, and taught his son 2 things about stone that Abram had carried without knowing he was carrying them. First, stone remembers heat longer than wood. Second, the wall that faces the fire gives back warmth long after the flame dies. Elias used to warm flat stones near the shop stove and slide them into a sick calf's pen on bitter nights. Not because stone generated heat, because stone held it, because stone was slow, slow to warm, slow to cool. And that slowness was the difference between a calf alive at dawn and a calf stiff as a board. Abram looked at the cleft. Two house-sized boulders, their faces roughly parallel, creating a slot perhaps 13 feet long and a little over 4 feet across at the narrowest point. The wagon box, stripped of wheels, running gear, boughs, and canvas, was 11 feet long and just under 4 feet wide. If he could remove the broken running gear, drag the box sideways into the gap, and wedge it between the stone faces, the granite would become two walls he did not have to build. The wind could not enter a slot sealed by wood on one end and stone on 3 sides. A small fire inside that space would not fight the wind. The stone would absorb heat from the fire and radiate it back into the enclosed air. Not much, not fast, but steadily. Snow packed over a roof of pine boughs and poles would insulate the top, trapping the warm air inside instead of letting it escape upward. The shelter would not be warm, but it would be alive. He did not explain this to Martha. Not yet. He measured. He found a broken wagon bough, a curved hickory rib from the torn canvas frame, and used it as a gauge. He walked the cleft from end to end, marking the width at 3 points. He checked the height of the boulder faces, taller than a man at the front, tapering to about 5 feet at the rear. He kicked at the ground inside the gap and found frozen dirt over solid rock. No mud, no pooling water, a floor that would not turn to slush under body heat. Then he walked back to the wagon, pulled the spoke shave from the chest, and began cutting notches in the wagon box panels where they would need to flex to fit the narrowing cleft. Martha watched him. She did not ask what he was doing. She watched his hands, and she watched the cleft, and after 30 seconds she began sorting cargo into piles. Food, tools, bedding, stove parts, clothing. Every pile was a decision about what fit inside the gap and what stayed outside to freeze or be buried. Amos Dole appeared. Amos was 41, a farmer from Iowa, a decent man with 2 mules, a wife named Clara, and the kind of imagination that extended precisely as far as the next planting season and no further. He had camped 30 yards from Abram because Haskell assigned positions, not because Amos wanted proximity to trouble. Now he stood at the edge of the cleft and watched Abram measure stone with a wagon bough, and his face carried the expression of a man watching another man lose his mind in an orderly fashion. "You are putting the wagon in the rocks," Amos said. "I am putting the box in the gap," Abram said. "Not the wagon, the box." "That is not a shelter. A wagon box is pine planking. Fire inside pine planking is suicide. The fire sits on stone. The walls are stone. The box is the plug, not the stove. Smoke will blind you before midnight." Abram held up the candle stub. He walked into the cleft and set it on a flat ledge at waist height. The flame drew toward the lee side, bending gently, pulling air through the gap in a slow, visible current. "Watch the flame," Abram said. Amos watched. "Air moves through here even with the wind blocked," Abram said. "The boulders are not the same height. The gap at the back is lower than the front. The draft runs downhill. If I put the smoke exit at the lee side near the low point and leave a finger-width gap at the base of the windward seal, air enters low and smoke exits high. You learned this from a candle. I learned this from my father. He built lime kilns. A kiln that does not draft will choke. A kiln that drafts too fast will burn cold. The principle is the same." Amos shook his head. "Principles do not keep children alive. Firewood keeps children alive. How much wood do you have?" "Not enough for open ground. Enough for an enclosed space where the wind does not steal the heat." "And if the wind shifts and your draft reverses and the smoke fills the box?" Then I open the windward seal and let the cold in until the air clears. And freeze while you wait. I will be cold. I will not be dead. Amos stared at the cleft, at the candle flame standing nearly straight in its stone corridor, at Abram's hands already moving back to the wagon box with the spoke shave. You are gambling your family on a candle, Amos said. I'm gambling my family on stone snow and a draft. The candle is how I check my work. Amos left. He did not offer help. He did not offer condemnation. He walked back to his own wagon and began tightening his canvas against the coming wind, and he did it with the expression of a man who expected to bury a neighbor before the week was out. The risk calculation was merciless, and Abram knew it. If he stripped the running gear and dragged the box into the cleft and the fit was wrong, if the planking split, if the boulders narrowed too sharply, if the box jammed at an angle that left gaps too wide to seal, he would have destroyed their shelter and wasted the last daylight. A torn canvas wagon was still a wagon. A splintered box wedged between boulders was firewood. If he did nothing, they froze in canvas with a broken axle and a storm 36 hours out. He chose the boulders. The train began moving at sundown, just as Haskell had promised. 30 wagons creaked and groaned past Abram's position, one by one, their canvas covers catching the last orange light like dirty lanterns. Some drivers looked at him. Most did not. A woman in the 4th wagon crossed herself. A boy in the 9th wagon pointed and said something to his mother that made her pull him back from the sideboard. Levi stood at Abram's shoulder and watched them pass. They think we are dead already, Levi said. Then they will not miss us, Abram said. He handed Levi the short axe. Cut every sapling you can reach, arm's length or longer. Stack them beside the south boulder. Do not stop until I tell you or until you cannot see your hand. Levi went. Orrin Platt's freight wagon was the last in line. Orrin drove 2 spans of mules and carried trade goods, spare parts, and the compressed menace of a man who understood that other people's disasters were his best inventory. He owned 2 spare wagons. He sold shelter space to stranded travelers at prices that made Haskell angry, and Haskell's anger irrelevant. He also wanted Abram's tool chest, specifically the augers and the spoke shave, which were worth more at the mines than Orrin's entire load of salt and candles. Orrin pulled his freight wagon to a stop beside Abram's position. He climbed down wearing a fox fur collar that made his head look small and mean, and he walked to where Martha stood sorting cargo by the failing light. $18 for both horses, Orrin said, and I will haul whatever the children can hold on their laps. The horses are worth 40, Martha said. The horses are worth what someone will pay a dead man's wife for them after the storm, Orrin said. 18 is generous when the alternative is digging them out of a drift come spring. We are not selling the horses. Then I will take the tool chest, $8. It is worth 30, but I'm being charitable. You are being a vulture, Martha said. Orrin smiled. He had the kind of smile that used all the right muscles and none of the right feeling. I am being practical, he said. Your husband is putting your children into a rock crack and calling it a house. I am offering you a way out. The way out is through the winter, Martha said. With the tools, with the horses, with the shop Abram will build in South Pass City. He will not build anything. He will not reach South Pass City. He will freeze in that crack, and in the spring someone will find the wagon box and your husband's body, and they will say, "Here is a man who thought he was smarter than weather." Martha said nothing. She turned back to her piles. Orrin raised his voice so the nearest travelers could hear. He is plugging a grave with his own wagon. Someone laughed. It carried in the cold air, thin and sharp. Orrin climbed back onto his freight wagon and drove west with the rest of the train. The fox caller turned once, catching the last light, and then he was gone. Martha stood alone beside the cargo piles. Her breath came in short white bursts. Her hands shook, and not entirely from cold. Abram walked to her. He did not touch her because Martha did not want comfort when she was angry. She wanted a plan. "Can you do this?" she asked. "I do not know." "That is not what I asked. I asked if you can do this." Abram looked at the cleft, at the broken wagon, at Ruth, who had climbed into the gap and was testing the walls with her palms the way she had seen her father do, at Jonas, who had crawled back into his spot between the boulders and fallen asleep with his coat balled under his head and his cough rattling in his chest like a stone in a tin pail. "Yes," he said, "I can do this." "Then do it before the light is gone." The work began with the unloading. Every barrel, every sack, every tool, every blanket, every iron strap and coil of rope came out of the wagon box and onto the frozen ground beside the boulders. Martha organized. Ruth carried. Levi returned from the tree line with an armload of saplings and went back for more. Abram worked on the wagon box itself. First, remove the boughs. The curved hickory ribs that held the canvas cover were lashed and pinned to the sideboards. Abram knocked the pins loose with a hammer, catching each bough as it sprang free, stacking them beside the south boulder because they would serve as roof ribs later. Second, cut the running gear away. The front axle was intact but useless without the rear. Abram used the broad axe to chop the bolster pins and hound connections that held the box to the frame. Each cut sent vibrations through the frozen wood that he felt in his teeth. The box was built to stay on the gear. It did not want to come off. He cut and pried and hammered for 20 minutes, and the box did not move. Third, brace the box. Before it could be dragged free, the bottom planking needed support, or it would sag and split. Abram slid 2 of the salvaged boughs under the box lengthwise, creating runners, rough, imperfect, but enough to let the box slide over frozen ground without catching. The light was failing. The pewter sky had darkened to iron. Wind came in gusts now, not steady, each gust colder than the last, each one carrying a few grains of ice that stung exposed skin like sparks. Martha lit the lantern. In its yellow circle, the family worked. Levi cut rope into measured lengths. Ruth gathered every nail that had fallen during the disassembly, feeling for them in the dirt with bare fingers because gloves made her clumsy. Jonas slept in the cleft, his cough marking time like a broken clock. Abram harnessed both horses to the front of the box. He ran rope from the box corners to the harness traces, creating a crude drag arrangement. The horses stamped and blew. The bay turned its head again with that same flat look. "Pull," Abram said. The horses leaned into the traces. The box scraped forward off the broken gear and onto the frozen ground with a sound like a ship leaving a dock, wood groaning against earth, runners biting, the whole structure shuddering as it broke free from the frame that had held it for 1,000 miles. It was loose. An 11-foot pine box sitting on 2 hickory runners in the middle of a granite boulder field in Wyoming Territory in October, with the light dying and the storm building, and a man who repaired wagons for a living trying to turn one into something it was never built to be. Abram turned the horses toward the cleft. The gap was 30 feet away. The ground between was rough, scattered with loose stone and frozen brush. He would need to guide the box through a slight turn, align it with the narrowing slot, and drive it into the gap without cracking the sideboards on the boulder faces. He had done this before, in a way. Not this. but he had guided damaged wagons onto repair cradles in his Zanesville shop, easing broken frames into tight spaces where a quarter-inch of misalignment meant a cracked spoke or a split felloe. He knew the feel of wood moving against resistance. He knew when to push and when to let the weight settle. "Levi," he called. "Left side, hands on the sideboard. Guide it straight. Do not let it swing." Levi took position. Martha took the right side. Ruth held the lantern high. "Pull," Abram said. The horses pulled. The box moved. It scraped across frozen ground, throwing sparks where the runners hit granite. It moved toward the cleft in a slow, grinding crawl, and Abram walked behind it with his hands on the rear panel, feeling the wood for flex, listening for the sound that meant splitting. The mouth of the cleft was wider than the box by nearly a foot on each side. The box entered cleanly. 6 feet in, the gap narrowed. The left sideboard touched stone. The box slowed. The horses strained. "Hold," Abram said. He checked the gap on both sides. The left was touching. The right had 3 inches. The boulder faces were not parallel. They converged at a shallow angle, which meant the box would tighten as it went deeper. He had cut notches in the sideboards for exactly this reason, at the points where the wood needed to flex inward to match the narrowing cleft. But notches in cold pine were gambles. The wood might flex, the wood might crack. "Pull," he said. "Slow." The horses pulled. The box inched forward. Wood pressed against stone. A sound came from the left sideboard, not a crack, but a groan, a deep complaint from pine fibers forced to bend in a direction God had not intended. Levi pressed his shoulder against the left panel, trying to keep it from catching on a rough spot in the granite. Martha pushed from the right. Abram guided from behind, his boots slipping on frozen ground, his hands numb on the rear planking. 8 feet in. 9. The groaning got louder. "It is going to split," Levi said. "It is not going to split," Abram said, because saying it was all he had. 10 feet. The box jammed. The left plank caught on a slight bulge in the granite face. The horses pulled, and the box did not move, and the left sideboard began to bow inward with a sound that made Ruth lower the lantern, because she did not want to see the wood break. Abram dropped to his knees and felt the point of contact. A rounded knob of granite, no bigger than his fist, protruding from the boulder face. It was catching the sideboard edge and creating a pressure point that would split the plank if the horses pulled any harder. He pulled the short axe from his belt. The light was almost gone. He could barely see the knob. He struck it twice, aiming by feel, and on the second strike a chip of granite the size of a coin flew off and hit him in the cheek hard enough to draw blood. "Pull," he said, wiping blood with his sleeve. The horses pulled. The box moved. It scraped past the knob with a shudder that Abram felt in his wrists, and then it slid, suddenly, faster than he expected, into the deepest part of the cleft, and stopped with a sound like a door closing. Wood against stone on both sides, wedged, tight, not coming out without the same effort that put it in. No one spoke. The wind blew over the top of the boulders, and inside the cleft, for the first time since the axle broke, they could hear each other breathing. The box was in. The roof was open sky. The windward end was unsealed. The stove was still outside in a pile of cargo on frozen ground. The firewood was 8 saplings and the broken running gear from the ruined wagon. The storm was hours away, maybe less, and the temperature was dropping fast enough that the puddles of grease Ruth had caught were already frozen solid in the tin cup. The wagon was wedged between 2 giant boulders, and it was not a shelter yet. It was a box and a crack. The difference between a coffin and a cabin was the roof, the seal, and the fire. and Abram had none of them. The wind picked up. Somewhere out in the darkness, a horse bell rang once and stopped, as if the wind had slapped it silent. Abram looked up at the open sky above the cleft, where the first true snow was beginning to fall, and he understood that everything he had done so far was the easy part. Abram worked by lantern light, and the lantern was dying. The roof came first. Without it, the cleft was a trench open to snowfall, and every flake that settled on the wagon box floor was moisture that would soak bedding, rust tools, and steal heat from anyone who lay against it. He had the salvaged wagon boughs, 5 curved hickory ribs, each about 4 feet long, and the saplings Levi had cut, green and limber, none thicker than a man's wrist. He had hemp rope fraying at both ends. He had the torn canvas from the wagon cover, which amounted to 3 pieces, one roughly 8 feet square, one 4 by 6, and one strip barely wide enough to wrap a barrel. He laid 2 bows across the gap at the widest point, resting their ends on the boulder faces. The granite was rough enough to hold the curved wood without lashing, but Abram lashed them anyway, looping rope around each bow end and wedging the loop tight against the stone with small rocks hammered into cracks. The boughs sat about 5 feet above the wagon box floor, low enough that a man could not stand beneath them, high enough that smoke would have space to gather and move toward the exit. Levi handed saplings up from outside the cleft, while Abram laid them crosswise over the boughs, spacing them a hand's width apart. The green wood bent under its own weight between the supports, creating shallow dips that would collect snow instead of shedding it. That worried Abram. He did not want weight concentrating at low points. He was trying to solve this problem, cursing the saplings, pulling them off and rearranging them, wasting minutes he did not have, when a voice came from the darkness beyond the south boulder. "You are building the roof wrong." The voice was low, thick with an accent Abram could not immediately place, and delivered with the calm authority of a man who had watched buildings collapse and learned from each one. Jory Tregenza stepped into the lantern light. He was 59 years old, barrel-chested, with hands that looked like they had been carved from the same stone they had spent 30 years breaking. His beard was gray and cropped close. His coat was canvas, patched at both elbows with leather, and his boots were miner's boots, heavy, hobnailed, caked with mud that came from underground rather than any trail. He carried a short-handled sledge on his shoulder the way another man might carry a walking stick. He had not been part of Haskell's train. He had been traveling alone, on foot, from the Sweetwater mines toward the Wind River country, and the approaching storm had driven him to the boulder field for the same reason Abram had found it. Granite stopped wind. "The poles need to run lengthwise, not crosswise," Jory said. He did not ask permission. He set his sledge against the south boulder and climbed into the cleft with the ease of a man who had spent his working life in spaces too small for standing. Crosswise poles span the gap, but the load sits on the span. Lengthwise poles rest on the boulders themselves. The stone carries the weight. The poles only carry what is between them. Abram looked at the arrangement. Jory was right. Crosswise saplings turned the roof into a series of bridges, each one bearing the full load of snow at its weakest point, the middle. Lengthwise poles, resting on the boulder faces, transferred weight to the stone and left only the narrow gaps between poles to be covered. "You have worked with roofs," Abram said. "I have worked under them," Jory said, "in Cornwall, in Michigan copper, in the Sweetwater shafts. A roof that fails in a mine does not leak, it kills." He did not offer his name yet. He rearranged the saplings, pulling each one free and laying it lengthwise across the gap, resting the ends on slight ledges in the boulder faces. Where no ledge existed, he used the flat of his sledge to chip 1, 2 sharp strikes that broke off granite flakes the size of playing cards and left a rough shelf just wide enough to seat a pole end. Now, he said, boughs across the poles, not along them. Then your canvas, then snow if it comes. The snow is your friend if the frame is right. It fills the gaps, packs down, and traps air. Trapped air does not move. Air that does not move does not steal heat. You sound like my father, Abram said. Your father was a miner? A kiln builder. He said stone remembers heat. Jory looked at him for the first time with something other than professional assessment. Your father was not wrong. Stone remembers. It is slow and it remembers. That is why miners trust it more than timber. Timber forgets, stone holds. He held out his hand. Jory Tregenza, Cornish, 30 years underground. I'm going nowhere tonight, and you need a man who knows how rock behaves when weight presses on it. Abram took the hand. The grip was the hardest thing he had ever felt. Abram Vale, Ohio, wagon repairman. I am trying to make a box into a cabin. You are trying to make a box into a mine, Adit, Jory said, and you're closer than you think. They worked together. The speed of the construction doubled with Jory in the cleft, not because he was stronger than Abram, though he was, but because he understood stone the way Abram understood wood, and between the two of them, every problem had a material that could solve it. The first teaching came through the stone itself. Jory picked up Abram's hammer and tapped the south boulder face near the base. The sound was high, clean, ringing. He tapped the same face 6 feet up. The sound was duller, with a slight buzz. Hear that, Jory said. The low stone is solid through. The high stone has a seam. Fracture line, may be old, maybe not. Do not press anything against that face above this mark. He scratched a line in the granite with the hammer claw. Weight above this line may shear a flake off. Flake falls. It takes your roof with it. Abram moved a lashing point 6 inches lower, a quarter-hour of work saved by a tap and a practiced ear. The second teaching was cribbing. The wagon box fit tight against the boulders, but tight was a problem when the narrowing cleft put uneven pressure on the sideboards. Jory cut short blocks from a broken sapling, 6 inches long, flat on 2 sides, and wedged them between the sideboard and the granite at 3 points along each wall. Crush blocks, he said. Sacrificial wood. If the stone shifts or the box swells with moisture, the blocks take the pressure and split instead of your wall. Miners use them in shaft bracing. The crib fails first. The roof holds. Third teaching. This one saved lives. Jory crouched beside the spot where Abram planned to set the sheet iron cook stove and shook his head. Fire in a closed space, Jory said. You know what kills men in mines? Not collapse, not flood, dead air. Fire eats the good air and leaves the bad. You cannot see it. You cannot smell it until it is too late. And then you do not wake up. He did not use the word that men in a later century would use. He called it dead air, because that was what Cornish miners called it, and because the name was accurate. You need intake and exhaust, Jory said. Low intake, high exhaust. Air comes in cold at the floor, feeds the fire, rises with the smoke, and exits through a slit at the top of the lee side. If the intake is too large, the wind enters and you lose heat. If the exhaust is too small, the smoke has nowhere to go, and it pools at head height, and the children breathe it. He made Abram cut a gap at the base of the windward seal, a horizontal slot 3 inches high and 18 inches wide, shielded from direct wind by a board propped at an angle outside it. Then he made Abram cut a slit in the canvas roof covering at the lee end, near where the boulders converged and the cleft tapered to its narrowest point. Test it, Jory said. Abram lit the candle stub and held it near the intake gap. The flame bent inward, drawn by the draft. He moved it to the center of the cleft, near the stove position. The flame rose straight. He moved it to the roof slit. The flame bent outward, pulling toward the exit. The draft worked. Air entered low, crossed the fire, rose with the heat, and exited high. The smoke would follow the heat. The good air would stay near the floor, where the children would sleep. Jory nodded. Now you can burn without dying. Do not be proud of this. Check the draft every time the wind changes. If the candle goes flat at any point, open the windward seal and get the children's faces to the floor until the air clears. The fourth teaching was roof load. With the lengthwise poles in place, Jory showed Abram and Levi how to lay pine boughs in overlapping rows across the poles, needles pointing downward so snow melt would drip off rather than pooling on the branch forks. Over the boughs went the canvas pieces, overlapping at the seams, weighted at the edges with stones too heavy for wind to lift. Over the canvas went the first layer of snow, scooped from the ground around the boulders and packed by hand 4 inches deep, filling every gap and seam. Snow over canvas, over boughs, over poles, Jory said. Each layer does one thing. Poles carry weight, boughs shed water, canvas blocks wind, snow traps air. Take any one away and the others fail. Together they are a roof, not a good roof, not a dry roof, but a roof that will hold until the storm passes or until we die of something other than cold. The work continued. Martha sealed the windward end of the cleft, the open mouth where the wagon box ended and the boulder gap continued. With planking stripped from the wagon's tailgate and running gear frame, she packed mud from beneath the south boulder, where the ground was sheltered enough to be unfrozen 6 inches down, into every crack between the planks. Ruth carried the mud in the cracked Dutch oven, trip after trip, silent and focused, her hands brown to the wrists. Setback. One of the horses, the roan, the weaker of the two, went down on its front knees trying to drag a stone into position for the stove pad. The animal was exhausted, dehydrated, and shaking with cold. Abram had to choose, cut the harness and lose the pulling power, or keep the animal working and risk a broken leg that would mean killing it. He cut the harness. The roan folded onto its side and lay steaming in the dark. Levi sat with it, pressing his face against the animal's neck, saying nothing. The bay horse stood 10 feet away and watched with its head low. Setback. The short axe, which Abram had been using to notch and shape the windward seal planking, loosened at the head. The wedge that held iron to hickory had been soaking up cold and contracting all night. On a downswing, the head flew off the handle and disappeared into the snow beside the north boulder. Levi searched for it on his hands and knees. Ruth joined him. 5 minutes passed, then 10, and the axe head was the only tool that could notch pine quickly enough to seal the last 3 gaps in the windward wall. Ruth found it. She found it with her bare fingers because her mittens were too thick to feel the iron under the snow, and when she pulled it free, the frozen metal stuck to her skin for half a breath before she wrenched it loose. She cried once, sharp, looked at her reddened fingertips, and brought the axe head to Abram without speaking. He fitted it back on the handle, drove the wedge tight with the broad axe, and did not look at Ruth's hands because looking would have cost him the composure he needed to keep working. Then Amos Dole appeared for the second time. He came out of the darkness carrying a coil of rope, his own rope from his own wagon, the good rope, not frayed. He set it on the ground beside the cleft entrance and stood there with his hat in his hands and his breath pluming. "I still think you are wrong," Amos said. "I know," Abram said. "My wife says I should help. I told her I was not going to help a man build his own coffin. She told me the children did not choose the coffin. He set the rope down and left. Abram used the rope to lash the last roof poles. It held better than his own fraying hemp. The lashings drew tight and stayed tight, and the roof stopped shifting when the wind gusted over the boulder tops. Jory tested the draft one final time. He lit the candle and held it at the intake gap, at the stove position, at the roof slit. The flame drew cleanly at every point. Smoke from a burning twist of bark rose from the stove position to the roof slit in a smooth, steady line and vanished into the wind outside. The draft holds, Jory said. Orrin Platt had not left with the train. His freight wagon sat 200 yards west, anchored for the night because Orrin was not fool enough to travel in the dark with heavily loaded mules. He had watched the construction from his wagon seat, and now he walked to the edge of the lantern light and looked at the sealed cleft with the smoke slit, venting a thin line of bark smoke into the sky. Luck, Orrin said. A candle draws in a crack between two rocks. That does not mean it will draw when the snow is 4 feet deep on that pile of sticks you call a roof. It drew in the dark. It drew in the wind. It will draw in the snow, Abram said. You have convinced a miner and frightened a farmer's wife. That does not make you an engineer. Abram did not answer. He set the stove on the stone pad, fed it a handful of bark and 2 splits of sapling, and watched the smoke crawl upward through the cleft and out the slit in the roof like a gray thread being pulled by an invisible hand. The fire was small. The heat was slight. But inside the granite walls, with the wind sealed out and the draft running clean, the air around the stove lost its killing edge within minutes. Not warm. Not even close to warm. But different. The difference between stone cold and merely cold. The difference between a space that fought the fire and a space that held it. If you have ever been doubted by someone who could not see what you were building, tell us in the comments. We have all been there, and what Abram builds next makes every dismissal worth enduring. The stove sat on flat stones laid over the wagon box floor. Abram placed 2 fist-sized rocks near the stove's base to warm slowly. He positioned them a hand's width from the nearest plank wall, close enough to absorb heat from the stove's radiation, far enough to prevent the wood from scorching. The rocks would not become hot. They would become less cold, and less cold, in the arithmetic of survival, was a margin. Martha brought the bedding inside. Blankets first, then the straw tick that served as a mattress, then the children's coats, then the flour sacking. She laid everything on the wagon box floor, which was raised above the ground by the depth of the box itself, nearly 2 feet of air between the floor planks and the frozen earth. That gap was its own insulation, though Martha did not call it that. She called it keeping the children off the dirt. Jonas was carried in asleep. His cough had settled into a rhythm. 3 barks, a pause, a wet rattle, silence, then 3 barks again. Martha laid him on the straw tick with his coat over his chest and a blanket over the coat, and Ruth beside him for warmth. Ruth curled around her brother without being asked, the way she had every night since independence. Levi came inside last. He brought the oat bag and the coffee pot and the salt pork and the cracked Dutch oven, and he arranged them along the windward wall where Martha pointed, and then he sat against the south boulder and put his head on his knees and slept within a minute. Jory took the first watch. He sat near the intake gap with the candle on a stone ledge beside him, watching the flame. His job was simple. If the flame went flat, the draft was failing. If the flame reversed, the wind had shifted, and the smoke slit was now the intake, which meant carbon was pooling at the ceiling. If the flame guttered and died, The fire was eating all the oxygen, and everyone needed to wake up and open the windward seal regardless of the cold. Sleep, Jory told Abram. I've watched air for 30 years. I will not miss it. Abram lay down beside Martha. The stove ticked as the iron warmed. The stone walls blocked every sound from outside except the deepest bass notes of the wind, which came through the granite as a vibration more felt than heard. Inside the cleft, for the first time since the axle broke, there was something close to quiet. It did not last. The storm front arrived before midnight, and it did not arrive as snowfall. It arrived as a wall. The first sign was the sound. Not wind exactly. Wind implies movement, direction, the air going from one place to another. This was pressure, a physical weight of atmosphere dropping onto the boulder field like a hand pressing flat on a table. The intake gap, which had been drawing air smoothly for 2 hours, suddenly whistled, a high, thin scream that woke everyone except Jonas, who was too deep in fever sleep to hear. Then the temperature fell, not gradually, not in the gentle downward curve that weather follows on ordinary nights. It fell the way a stone falls from a hand. 1 minute the air inside the cleft was cold but breathable. The next, every breath hurt. The moisture in Abram's nostrils froze on the inhale and thawed on the exhale, and each cycle felt like touching the inside of his nose with a needle. Jory checked the candle. The flame was bending hard toward the intake, which meant the draft was pulling strongly, too strongly. Wind outside was creating suction at the smoke slit, drawing air through the cleft faster than the stove could heat it. Close the intake by half, Jory said. Abram reached for the board that shielded the intake gap and shifted it to cover 2/3 of the opening. The whistle dropped in pitch. The candle flame straightened. The draft slowed. Good, Jory said. Now we balance. Too much intake and we freeze. Too little and we choke. The answer is somewhere in between, and it moves every time the wind shifts. Outside, the world ended. Snow came not from the sky, but from everywhere. Horizontally, diagonally, in spirals and curtains that wrapped around the boulders and probed every crack. The sound was not the soft hiss of ordinary snowfall. It was a roar, steady and relentless, punctuated by deeper booms when wind gusts hit the granite faces and bounced off with the force of breaking waves. Martha counted breaths. She did this not from panic, but from method. Jonas's breaths per minute told her whether his fever was climbing or holding. She counted 12 breaths per minute, which was fast for a sleeping child. She adjusted the blanket around his chest. She moved the warm stone, wrapped in a rag, closer to his feet. She did not sleep. Complication. The roof cracked. Ruth heard it first. A sharp report, like a stick breaking, somewhere above and to the left of the stove. She sat up and stared at the roof, where the lantern light caught a thin line of white dust falling from between two poles. Snow dust, fine as flour, sifting through a gap that had opened when one of the crosswise bough layers shifted under accumulating weight. She said nothing. She watched the dust fall for 10 seconds, and then she reached up and pressed her mitten against the gap, packing the boughs back into place. The dust stopped. Ruth lay back down and put her arm over Jonas. She was 10 years old and had just done the only thing she could do, and she had done it without waking anyone, because waking them would have meant admitting the roof might fail, and she could not afford to believe that. But the crack was real. The weight was building. Snow accumulated on the roof in layers, each gust depositing an inch, then another inch, then packing it down with the next gust until the surface was a dense, compressed slab that grew heavier by the hour. The lengthwise poles seated on their granite ledges held. The boughs held. but the canvas between the boughs and the snow was stretching, and where it stretched, gaps opened, and where gaps opened, snow dust came through. Outside the cleft, the boulder field was disappearing. Drifts climbed the south boulder face like white ladders. The intake gap, which sat at ground level on the windward side, began to collect snow in its mouth. Abram cleared it twice with his hand, scooping packed snow from the board's edge. And the second time, his fingers came back white and senseless. Jory's cough worsened. It had started as a clearing of the throat, the kind of sound a man makes when cold air hits lungs that have spent 30 years breathing rock dust. By the second hour of the storm, it was a deep, wet hack that came in pairs and left Jory leaning against the boulder with his eyes closed and his mouth tasting of iron. He said nothing about it. He watched the candle. The stove consumed wood at a rate Abram tracked by counting splits. Each split of green sapling burned for roughly 20 minutes. He had started the night with what he estimated at 40 splits of sapling, plus the broken running gear wood from the wagon, which was seasoned oak and hickory and burned longer. He rationed. 2 splits at a time in the stove, no more. When the fire burned low, he waited until the iron cooled enough that the next split would catch slowly rather than flaring. At the current rate, he had fuel for 2 nights. If the storm lasted 3, he would burn the wagon boughs. If it lasted 4, he would burn the tool chest lid. After that, the options were the tool handles, the straw tick frame, and the wagon box itself, which meant burning the walls of the shelter to heat the inside of the shelter, which was the arithmetic of despair. 3 hours into the storm, Jonas stopped coughing. Martha's hand went to his chest. She felt the rise and fall. He was breathing. He was not coughing because his body had stopped trying to clear the congestion and started trying to conserve heat. His skin was cool, not cold. The blankets and the warm stone had done their work, but cool enough that Martha's calm cracked for the first time since the axle broke. She lifted Jonas and carried him to the south boulder wall, where the granite beside the stove had been absorbing radiant heat for 3 hours. The stone was not warm to the touch, but it was dry, and it had lost the bitter edge that made bare stone feel like metal in winter. She pressed Jonas's back against the wall and held him there, her body curled around his, her hands on his chest, counting breaths again. 12 per minute. Holding. Jory spoke from his post by the intake. "The boy needs warm air in his lungs, not warm stone on his back. Keep him low. The warmest air is at floor level, between the stove and the intake. Cold air sinks, hot air rises. The good air, warm and breathable, sits in the middle and pools at the floor where the draft feeds it past the stove." Martha moved Jonas to the floor beside the stove, on the straw tick, with blankets packed around him. She lay with her face at his level and breathed the air there. It was warmer. Not comfortable, but the difference between the air at floor level and the air at head height was enough that she could feel it on her lips. The night ground on. Abram and Jory traded watch and 2-hour shifts, each man sleeping with one ear tuned to the candle, not watching it, but listening for the change in draft sound that would mean the flame had died or reversed. Ruth slept in bursts, waking each time the roof cracked or Jonas's breathing changed, pressing her mitten against gaps, adjusting blankets, doing the quiet work of a child who had accepted that survival was a task and tasks required attention. Levi woke once, crawled to the intake gap, and pressed his face against the board. He was trying to see the horses. They were staked in a partial lee behind the south boulder, under a canvas scrap tied between 2 pine trunks. He could see nothing. He could hear nothing except wind. He crawled back to his place and did not sleep again. 4 hours. 5. Outside, others suffered more. The Kepler family, a man, his wife, and 3 children, had refused to stop when Haskell called the halt. They had pushed a half-mile west of the boulder field, trying to reach a creek bottom that the husband believed would offer better shelter. The storm caught them in the open. The wind overturned their wagon on a slope. Canvas tore. The family crawled beneath the capsized bed and lay in mud and snow while the temperature dropped past any reading the exposed thermometers could hold. Haskell found them the next morning. They were alive, barely. The wife's hands were white to the wrists. The youngest child could not stand. They survived because the capsized wagon bed acted as a crude roof, and the mud beneath them, insulated by their own body heat, did not freeze solid. They survived, but the word survive did them generous service. Mace Bell was not that lucky. Bell was a hired driver for Orrin Platt's freight outfit, a young man from Missouri who had signed on for wages and found himself responsible for 6 mules in a blizzard. When one of the mules broke its stake and bolted, Bell went after it. He was wearing a canvas coat, wool trousers, and boots that were adequate for walking beside a wagon and inadequate for everything else. He walked into the storm and did not come back. His body was found 2 days later, face down in a drift a quarter-mile north of the trail, one hand still holding a lead rope that was attached to nothing. The storm killed Mace Bell because he had no shelter between his coat and the wind. The distance between life and death was not firewood or blankets or even warmth. It was a wall. Anything that stopped the wind stopped the killing. Bell had no wall. The Keplers had a capsized wagon. Abram had 2 boulders and a pine box packed with snow. Inside the cleft, the stove burned. The candle drew. The smoke crawled upward and out. The granite walls stood as they had stood for 10,000 years, indifferent to the wind that screamed over their tops, and the air inside the gap, the still, enclosed, protected air, held its small portion of heat the way a miser holds a coin. At the 5th hour, the smoke slit iced over. Jory smelled it first. Not smoke, the absence of draft. The candle flame, which had been bending gently toward the lee side for hours, went straight. Then it leaned toward the intake. Then it began to gutter. "Vent is blocked," Jory said. "Ice on the outside. The moisture and the smoke is freezing on the cold canvas at the slit and sealing it shut." The effect was immediate. Smoke that had been exiting cleanly began to pool at the roof. Within a minute, the air at head height was thick enough to taste sharp, acrid, stinging the eyes. Within 2 minutes, Martha was coughing. Ruth pulled her coat over Jonas's face. "If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because what Abram does next decides whether the shelter saves them or kills them." "Open the windward seal," Jory said. "All of it. Let the cold in. Get the smoke out. Then go on the roof and clear the slit." Abram pulled the board from the intake gap. Cold air hit him like a fist. The temperature inside the cleft, which had been hovering somewhere above 0, dropped instantly as wind poured through the gap and pushed the smoke backward, up and out, through every crack in the roof. The shelter went from smoky to freezing in 30 seconds. "Rope," Abram said. Jory tied the hemp rope around Abram's waist, looped it once around his own forearm, and braced his feet against the south boulder. "If I pull 3 times, you come back whether you have cleared it or not." Abram went out through the lee gap, a narrow space between the north boulder and the hillside, where the wind was broken enough for a man to stand. The world outside was not a world. It was white noise made physical. Snow drove horizontal. The air was so full of ice that breathing felt like drinking sand. He could not see the roof. He could not see the boulders above him. He climbed by feel, jamming his boots into the cracks between granite and frozen earth, pulling himself up the south boulder face with hands he could not feel. The roof was a white mound, formless, already buried under what felt like 2 feet of packed snow. He crawled across it on hands and knees, sweeping with his forearm, trying to find the slit by the absence of solid surface. Twice he swept over the spot without finding it. The third time his hand broke through a crust of ice and plunged into warm, moist air rising from inside the cleft. The smoke slit, sealed by a plug of frozen condensation an inch thick. He pulled the hatchet from his belt, the same hatchet that had chipped the granite knob inside the cleft, and struck the ice. The first blow cracked it. The second broke it loose in chunks. The third opened the slit to its full width, and a column of gray smoke erupted from the opening like a breath held too long. Jory felt the rope go slack and pulled twice. Abram turned to crawl back. That was when Jory's mitten tore. The Cornishman had braced himself against the boulder with his free hand, pressing his palm against the granite to hold position, while Abram's weight pulled at the rope. His mitten, which was old wool already split at the seam, caught on a sharp edge of stone and ripped open. His bare hand touched the iron hatchet head that Abram had set down on the boulder face for 1 second while re-gripping the rope. Skin froze to iron. The bond was instant. Jory hissed through his teeth and held still, because pulling would mean tearing skin from the palm. Abram, coming back over the roof, saw the shape of the problem before he saw the details. Jory's arm extended, his hand locked to something on the stone, his body rigid. Abram knocked the hatchet sideways with the heel of his boot. The iron broke free from Jory's palm with a sound like tearing cloth. Jory pulled his hand to his chest and squeezed it with the other hand and said nothing. They went back inside. Abram sealed the intake gap to a 2-inch slit. The draft reestablished. The smoke resumed its upward crawl. The candle flame bent toward the lee. Jory sat by the stove and unwrapped his hand. A strip of skin, thin as paper, was missing from the heel of his palm where it had frozen to the iron. The wound was not bleeding. The cold had sealed it. But the skin around it was white and hard, and the fingers on that hand were curling inward in a way that had nothing to do with the cold and everything to do with damage. Frostbite, Jory said, as if naming a species of rock. Superficial, I have had worse. He wrapped the hand in a strip of flour sacking and went back to watching the candle. At the 6th hour, Amos Dole's fist hit the windward seal. The sound was frantic, not the knock of a man asking, but the pounding of a man begging. Abram pulled the board open, and Amos fell through the gap with his wife Clara in his arms, and their youngest child, a girl of 3, pressed between them. Clara was not responsive. Her eyes were open, but she was not tracking. The child was crying in the high, thin wail of a body running out of warmth. The canvas split, Amos said. His voice was ragged. The wind took it. We have nothing. Please, Abram, please. The shelter could not hold more people. It was already too small for 5 adults and 2 children. Adding 3 more meant less air per person, more moisture from breathing, more carbon from the fire, less space to lie down, less heat per body. Jory looked at Abram. The candle flame was steady. The draft was running. The math said no. Bring them in, Abram said. They came in. Clara was laid beside the stove. Martha pressed warm stones wrapped in cloth against her hands and feet. The child was tucked between Ruth and Jonas. 3 children in a space meant for 1, their body heat pooling under blankets that smelled like smoke and wet wool and fear. Amos crouched by the windward wall with his head in his hands. He was the man who had said Abram was gambling his family on a candle. He was now alive because the candle was still burning. He said nothing. He did not need to. Jory adjusted the intake, wider now by half an inch to compensate for 3 additional pairs of lungs consuming oxygen. The candle flame flickered, steadied, and bent toward the lee. The draft held. The air held. The arithmetic of survival recalculated for 8 people instead of 5, still balanced, barely. The worst hour came just before dawn. The fire was nearly out. Abram had burned through the sapling splits, the wagon running gear wood, and 2 of the 5 salvaged boughs. He had 3 boughs left, 1 piece of the tailgate frame, and the choice he had been dreading, the tool chest lid. Jonas had not coughed in 2 hours. Martha's calm was gone. She held the boy against the south boulder wall, the wall that had been absorbing stove heat for 8 hours and now radiated a faint, steady warmth that Abram could feel with his palm from 6 inches away. Not hot, not even warm by any standard a person in a heated house would recognize, but warmer than the air, warmer than the floor, warmer than anything in the cleft except the stove itself. Martha pressed Jonas's back against that stone and placed the last warm rock wrapped in cloth at his feet. She spoke to him in a voice too low for anyone else to hear. Ruth pressed against his side. The 3-year-old from the Dole family slept against Ruth's back. Jory ordered everyone to breathe low and slow, short, shallow breaths through the nose, less oxygen consumed, less carbon produced, less moisture added to the air. The candle flame was burning at half height. The draft was a whisper. Abram fed the last split of pine into the stove. The bark caught. The wood hissed with moisture. Smoke curled upward, found the slit, and exited. The iron walls of the stove ticked as they warmed, and the small sound was the only evidence that fire still existed in the cleft. Outside, the spirit thermometer tied to Haskell's wagon tongue, 100 yards west, fully exposed, showed its lowest mark, 50 below zero, a number that stopped being weather and became physics. At 50 below, exposed skin freezes in minutes. Spit freezes before it hits the ground. Metal becomes so cold it burns like fire. The air itself feels solid, as if the atmosphere has thickened into something that must be pushed through rather than breathed. Inside the cleft, near the children, the cup of water Martha had set by the stove showed a skin of ice at its edges. The center was liquid. The water had not frozen solid. Outside, 50 below. Inside, cold enough to frost the surface of a cup. Not frozen through. That was the proof. Not dramatic. Not triumphant. A cup of water with ice at the rim and liquid in the center, sitting beside a dying fire in a pine box wedged between 2 boulders, surrounded by 8 people breathing shallow in the smoke-stained dark. The granite had held. It had absorbed heat from the stove hour after hour, slowly, the way Elias Vale's kiln stones had absorbed heat from the fire and given it back to the cellar wall. The snow on the roof had sealed every gap and trapped the warm air inside the way a blanket traps heat against a body. The draft had run clean because the boulders created a pressure difference between the windward and lee sides that pulled air through the shelter in a steady, invisible current. The wagon box had blocked the open ends of the cleft and turned a crack in the earth into a room. Wind, stone, snow, wood, fire. 5 elements arranged not by accident but by knowledge. A kiln builder's son's knowledge of how stone holds heat. A Cornish miner's knowledge of how air moves in closed spaces. And a wagon repairman's knowledge of how wood bends and fits and holds under pressure. The wind dropped at dawn, not all at once but in stages, like a hand slowly releasing its grip. The roar became a moan, the moan became a whisper, the whisper became silence. Abram crawled to the intake gap and pressed his face against the board. Through the slit, he could see gray light on white ground. The boulder field was gone, buried under drifts that turned every rock into a smooth white mound. The trail was gone. The sky was the color of old iron, flat and low, but the snow had stopped falling and the air was still. He listened for horse bells. He heard nothing. Morning was not a rescue. It was an inventory of damage. Abram crawled out through the lee gap and stood in snow that reached his thighs. The air was still, and the stillness after 12 hours of wind felt wrong, like the silence after a scream. His legs shook. His hands were swollen inside his mittens. He had not eaten since the previous afternoon, and the hunger hit him all at once, a wave of dizziness that made him grab the boulder face to keep his feet. The horses. He waded through the drift toward the south boulder's lee, where the two animals had been staked under a canvas scrap. The bay was standing. Its eyes were rimmed with frost, its coat stiff with frozen sweat, its head hanging low enough that its muzzle nearly touched the snow. But it was standing. Abram pressed his hand against its flank and felt the faint, steady engine of life still running beneath the hide. The roan was down. It lay on its side in a shallow trench. Its own body heat had melted into the drift. Its eyes were open. Its breath came in slow, ragged pulls. Its front legs twitched. Alive, but the kind of alive that could go either way. Levi appeared beside Abram. The boy stood in the snow and looked at the roan and did not speak. Then he knelt and pressed his face against the animal's neck and sobbed. Not a child's crying, but a 15-year-old's, rough and angry, the sound of someone who had held it together for 12 hours and could not hold any more. The last person who had depended on Levi was buried beside the Platte. Now the roan was down, and Levi's shoulders shook as if the whole accumulation of grief had found the one crack in his composure and poured through it. Abram let him cry. He could not afford to join him. He turned to look for Ruth's voice. Ruth was digging. She had crawled out of the cleft before anyone else, before Abram, before Martha, and she was pulling at a drift near the north boulder with both hands, throwing snow behind her like a dog. She found what she was looking for, the bell strap from the bay's harness, frozen into the crust, its brass bell packed with ice. She held it up and shook it, and no sound came out. She shook it harder. A thin, cracked note rang once and died. Ruth held the strap against her coat and worked the ice loose from the bell with her thumbnails until it rang clearly, and the sound carried across the white, silent boulder field, like a declaration that someone was still here and still working. Martha carried Jonas into the daylight wrapped in every blanket they owned. The boy was awake. His cough had returned. Which was good, Martha said, because coughing meant his lungs were fighting instead of surrendering. His face was gray, and his lips were cracked, and his eyes moved slowly. But he asked for water, and asking for water was the most alive thing anyone in the cleft had done since midnight. Clara Doles sat in the snow beside the cleft entrance with her daughter on her lap. Her hands were red and swollen, but she could move her fingers. The child was asleep. Amos stood behind them, looking at the sealed windward wall, the snow-covered roof, the smoke slit still venting a faint curl of gray from the banked stove inside. He looked at it the way a man looks at a bridge he has crossed that should have collapsed. The first visitor came within the hour. Captain Reuben Haskell rode back from the train's overnight position half a mile west. His horse moved through thigh-deep snow at a walk, picking its way between buried boulders with the care of an animal that had survived enough winters to respect what lay beneath white surfaces. Haskell dismounted and tied the horse to a pine trunk and walked to Abram's cleft without speaking. He studied it. He did not study it the way Amos had, with fear and confusion, or the way Oren had, with contempt. He studied it the way a man who had crossed the pass 6 times studied anything that surprised him, which was carefully, slowly, and with the humility of someone who knew that the frontier punished certainty. He walked the length of the south boulder face and noted where the snow had drifted against the stone and where the stone had deflected the drift. He crouched at the intake gap and felt the air moving through the slit. He climbed the low end of the north boulder and looked down at the roof, the snow layer, the canvas beneath it, the boughs beneath that, the poles seated on their granite ledges. He knelt and pressed his palm against the snow surface and felt its density. He came back down and walked to the lee side smoke slit. A thread of warm air rose from it, carrying the smell of pine smoke and human bodies and the faint mineral scent of heated granite. He held his hand in the rising air and felt the warmth. Then he went inside. He had to duck to enter through the lee gap, and inside the cleft the ceiling was too low for standing. He crouched beside the stove and looked at the stone pad beneath it, the fist-sized rock set near the iron walls, the gap between the rocks and the wooden planking. He looked at the south boulder face beside the stove and touched it with his bare hand. "The stone is warm," he said. "Not a question. It has been absorbing heat from the stove for 12 hours, Abram said. "It is not hot. It will never be hot, but it holds what it takes. My father called it remembering." Haskell touched the north boulder face opposite the stove. Colder, noticeably colder. The difference between the two walls, one near the fire, one far from it, was the difference between stone that had been fed heat and stone that had not. Both were granite. Both had started the night at the same temperature. The one near the fire had absorbed enough radiant heat over 12 hours to feel mild beneath a man's palm. The other still carried the deep, aching cold of stone that had never been warmed. "I told you a wagon could not be a cabin," Haskell said. "You did." "I did not reckon on the rock doing half the cabin's work." He said this without embarrassment and without deflection. He said it the way a man says a thing he has reconsidered and found himself wrong about, and the saying of it costs him something he is willing to pay because the alternative, staying wrong, costs more. "The rock does not do half the work," Abram said. "It does 3 things. It stops the wind, which is the first thing. It holds some heat from the fire, which is the second. And it gives that heat back slowly, which means the fire does not have to run hot every minute. The fire can burn low, and the stone fills the gap." "And the snow?" "The snow seals the roof. The trapped air in the snow does not move. Air that does not move does not steal heat. The snow becomes insulation, not burial." "And the draft?" "Intake low, exhaust high. The boulders are uneven. The windward side is taller. The lee side is lower. Wind creates pressure on the windward face and suction on the lee. Air is pulled through the shelter from bottom to top. The fire sits in the current. Smoke follows the heat out." Haskell stood, or rather straightened as much as the low roof allowed. He looked at the sleeping space where 7 people had spent the night. He looked at the water cup with its rim of ice and its liquid center. He looked at the candle on its stone ledge, flame still drawing toward the lee, proof that the draft was running even now, even in calm air, because the residual temperature difference between the warming south wall and the cooling north wall created its own gentle convection. "How many people in the train have frostbite?" Abram asked. 11. Kepler's wife may lose fingers. The bellboy is dead." "How many fires went out?" "At least 6. Wind tore through every canvas cover in the line. The families that kept flame did it by feeding wood all night and burning through what should have lasted them a week." "How much wood did I burn?" Haskell looked at the woodpile. 3 bow ribs, 1 piece of tailgate frame, a handful of bark scraps. Against the wall, the tool chest with its lid still attached. Less than any of them, Haskell said, because I was not heating the wind. I was heating the air that the wind could not reach. Haskell walked outside. He stood in the snow for a long time, looking at the 2 boulders, the sealed cleft between them, the smoke slit breathing its thin line of evidence. Then he turned to Abram. Can you teach this? I can teach the pieces, the stone reading, the draft testing, the snow sealing. Whether a man can find the right boulders and the right box and the right gap in the right storm, that I cannot teach. That is luck. Luck prepared, Haskell said. He remounted his horse. I am holding the train here until the injured can travel. The Kepler family needs shelter better than canvas. I will send them to you. He rode west without waiting for Abram's answer, because he had already decided, and waiting for agreement was a courtesy Haskell extended only to people he considered his equals. The fact that he had not waited was, in its own way, the highest compliment he could pay. Community members came throughout the day, not a flood. The snow was too deep for casual visiting, but a steady, deliberate trickle of people who had spent the night in canvas and wanted to understand how a man in a pine box had kept water from freezing solid. A teamster named Garfield Blunt asked about the intake gap. Abram showed him the board, the angle, the 2-inch slit that balanced airflow against heat loss. Blunt measured the slit with his thumb and forefinger and committed the width to memory. A woman named Patience Ott, traveling with her sister's family, asked about the roof layers. Martha answered. She described the sequence: poles, boughs, canvas, snow, and the reason for each layer, and she did it with the practical specificity of a woman who had carried mud in a Dutch oven and packed it into cracks with her bare hands while her son coughed in the dark. A boy of 12, the Kepler's eldest, asked how the smoke knew where to go. Ruth answered that one. She lit the candle and held it at 3 points inside the cleft: intake, center, exhaust, and let the boy watch the flame bend and draw. The boy said the flame looked like it was breathing. Ruth said it was. Jory watched these scenes from his place against the south boulder. He had not spoken since Haskell's visit. His bandaged hand rested in his lap, the flour sacking wrap stained with a pale yellow seep that Abram recognized as the fluid from damaged skin. Jory did not teach. He did not correct. He watched Abram explain stone reading to a farmer, draft testing to a teamster, roof layering to a mother of 4, and he nodded once, barely, when Abram got the sequence right. Then Jory said, "Make him answer, not you." He was talking to himself, but Abram heard it, and he understood. Jory had spent 30 years underground teaching younger miners how to read stone, test air, and brace ceilings. The teacher's hardest moment was not teaching. It was stepping back and letting the student teach, because teaching meant the knowledge had transferred, and the student no longer needed the teacher. Jory was watching himself become unnecessary, and he was doing it on purpose. Amos Dole's conversion was not public. It happened in the late afternoon, when the light was going gold, and the snow was beginning to crust. Amos came to the cleft carrying his own tools, a saw and a mallet, and asked Abram to help him bank snow against the north side of his repaired canvas cover. "I am not building your design," Amos said. "I do not have boulders. I am banking snow against canvas to stop the wind." "That is my design," Abram said. "Part of it. It is common sense." "Common sense that you called gambling yesterday." Amos set his jaw. He was not a man who apologized easily, and Abram did not expect him to. But Amos had carried his wife and child to Abram's cleft at 4 in the morning, and the debt of that could not be discharged with a saw and a mallet. Clara says the stone was warm, Amos said. She says she felt it through the blanket. She says the boy, your boy, slept against the wall, and the wall held him. The wall held heat. It held the boy by holding heat. I told you stone was cold. You were right. Stone is cold. Cold stone that has been near a fire for 8 hours is less cold. Less cold is enough. Amos stood for a moment. Then he said, "Show me the snow banking. Show me how deep. Show me the angle." Abram showed him. They packed snow against the north face of Amos's canvas cover, 3 feet deep, angled so the wind would ride up and over instead of pressing through. They left a low intake gap at the base and a vent slit at the top of the lee side. Amos tested the draft with a candle. The flame bent toward the lee. Amos looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "My wife was right." That was his conversion. Orrin Platt's reaction was denial, and denial was louder than silence. Orrin had spent the blizzard in his freight wagon, which was built heavier than an emigrant wagon and covered with oiled canvas that held better than common cotton. He had burned more wood than anyone in the train. His freighting operation carried spare fuel for exactly this reason. And he had survived in reasonable comfort, which he took as proof that conventional methods worked, and Abram's rock-cracked theater was unnecessary. But Mace Bell was dead. Bell had been Orrin's employee. Bell had gone after Orrin's mule. And while Orrin would never say that Bell's death was his responsibility, the boy went on his own, Orrin would insist. Nobody told him to walk into that wind. The fact remained that Bell had died in the open, while Abram's family had survived in a sealed crack, and every person in the train could do the arithmetic. Clara Dole did the arithmetic publicly. She stood near the cook fire that Haskell's people had built on cleared ground, and she told 3 women what had happened. She told them about the canvas splitting. She told them about the cold. She told them about Amos pounding on the rock, and she told them about the stone wall. "He called it a grave," Clara said, meaning Orrin. "He said Abram was plugging a grave. My child warmed inside that grave. My child slept against the stone wall, and the wall was warm." The women looked at Orrin's freight wagon. One of them, Patience Ott, said nothing, but her expression made silence louder than words. Orrin heard. He heard because sound carries in cold air, and because people who have survived a night that killed a man tend to speak at a volume that ensures the dead are not forgotten. He did not respond. He climbed into his freight wagon and pulled the canvas shut. But his face, in the moment before the canvas closed, carried the expression of a man who understood that something had shifted and that the shift was not in his favor. The days after the blizzard held the train in place. Haskell kept his word. No movement until the injured could travel. This meant Abram had time, and time was a currency he had not expected. Jory and Abram used it. They reinforced the cleft shelter, turning it from an emergency improvisation into a functional winter structure. Jory taught a 5th lesson: raised sleeping. Cold air pooled at the lowest point, which meant the wagon box floor, despite being elevated 2 feet above the ground, was still the coldest sleeping surface in the shelter. Jory showed Abram how to build a raised sleeping shelf using the remaining wagon bows as a frame, tool chests as legs, and boards from the broken running gear as a platform. The shelf lifted the sleeping surface 18 inches above the floor and put the bodies in the warmest band of air, above the cold pool at the floor, below the smoke layer at the ceiling. Abram taught Jory wagon box bracing. He showed the miner how pine planks expand and contract with moisture changes, how a box that is tight in dry air becomes loose in damp air and vice versa, and how to set wedges that compensated for swelling without cracking the joints. Jory understood immediately. because the principle was the same one he used in shaft timbering. Wood and stone moving at different rates, and the builder's job was to anticipate the movement and leave room for it. Their respect became mutual in the way that respect becomes mutual between men who know different things equally well. Abram could read wood the way Jory read stone. Jory could read air the way Abram could read a broken axle. Neither man would have survived the blizzard alone. Together, they had built something that neither could have designed from scratch. But Jory's hand was getting worse. He hid it for 3 days. He kept the flour sacking wrap in place and used his good hand for everything. Eating, building, testing draft. When Abram caught him flexing the damaged fingers behind the south boulder, Jory waved him off. When Martha noticed the seep staining the bandage yellow and then brown, Jory said it was draining, which was good, which meant the dead tissue was separating. On the 4th day after the blizzard, Abram found Jory sitting behind the north boulder with a knife in his good hand and the bandage unwrapped from the bad one. The skin on Jory's palm and 2 of his fingers was black, not the black of bruising, which carries blue and purple undertones, the black of dead tissue, dry and hard, pulling away from the living skin at the edges like bark peeling from a dead tree. Jory was trying to cut the dead skin away. "Stop," Abram said. "It has to come off. If the rot goes deeper, I lose the hand." "You need a doctor." "I need a knife and steady nerves. I have the knife." "Let Martha do it. She has steadier hands than either of us." Jory looked at him. The Cornishman's face was gray with pain he had been hiding for 4 days, and his eyes held the flat, pragmatic calculation of a man who had seen miners lose fingers and toes and had learned to treat the body as a work site where damaged material was removed so the structure could hold. Martha did it. She boiled water in the Dutch oven, cleaned the knife, and cut the dead skin away with the precision of a woman who had butchered hogs and dressed wounds, and understood that flesh was flesh regardless of whose body it came from. Jory held his arms steady against the boulder and watched, and did not make a sound except a single sharp exhale when the blade reached living tissue at the edge of the dead zone. When it was done, 2 fingers on Jory's right hand were stripped to raw flesh from the first knuckle to the palm. The other fingers were damaged but intact. He could close his fist, barely. He could not grip a hammer. He could not swing a sledge. He could not do the work that had defined him for 30 years. He wrapped the hand in clean cloth and sat by the stove and looked at the candle flame for a long time. "The roof vent," he said. "That is where I lost it. Iron in cold air." "You saved us." "I saved the draft. The draft saved you. I lost a grip." He flexed the damaged fingers and winced. A miner without a grip is a miner without a trade. That night, after the others slept, Abram sat beside Jory at the intake gap. The candle burned steady. The air outside was calm and cold. Stars showed through breaks in the cloud cover, bright and hard and indifferent. "What will you do?" Abram asked. "South Pass City has a doctor, or something close to one. He will look at the hand and tell me what I already know." "And after?" "After depends on the hand. If it heals with grip, I go back underground. If it does not, I find work that needs eyes and judgment more than fingers." "I need eyes and judgment," Abram said. Jory looked at him. "I'm opening a repair shop," Abram said. "Wagons, wheels, axles. The mines break equipment faster than men can buy replacements. I need someone who can read stone, read air, and tell me when a wall is sound. I need someone who can teach me what I do not know about building against rock." "You are offering charity." "I am offering partnership. You taught me to read a draft, test a stone face, and brace a roof against snow load. That knowledge is worth more than a grip." Jory did not answer that night. He watched the candle. 2 weeks after the blizzard, Haskell declared the train ready to move. The Kepler family had recovered enough to travel, though the wife's damaged fingers would mark her for life. The rest of the injured were mobile. The dead, Maysbell, had been buried in a cairn of loose stone at the north end of the boulder field, and Haskell had said words over it that were spare and honest, and did not pretend the death was part of a plan. The train moved west slowly, through snow that the horses broke with their chests. The cleft shelter was left behind, its roof still sealed, its stove cold, the wagon box wedged between the boulders like a wooden tooth in a granite jaw. It would stand through the winter. Travelers passing the boulder field in later months would see it and wonder. 3 days out from the boulder field, the secondary crisis hit. The trail followed a ravine between two ridges, where a thaw had destabilized the snowpack above the south-facing slope. Water ran beneath the crust during the day and froze at night, creating layers of ice sandwiched between layers of granular snow. The surface looked solid. It was not. The Kepler boy, the 12-year-old who had asked Ruth about the smoke, was walking ahead of his family's wagon when the crust gave way beneath him. He dropped through 4 feet of layered snow and ice into a pocket between two buried boulders, a void created by the rock's irregular surfaces and the way snow had bridged over the gap instead of filling it. His mother screamed. His father jumped from the wagon and ran to the hole and reached down but could not find the boy. The hole was narrow, barely wider than the child's shoulders, and it extended down into a jumble of rock and compacted snow where a wrong step would collapse the walls and bury whoever entered. Haskell reached the spot within minutes. He assessed the hole, the snow layers, the rock beneath, and said what everyone already felt. If they dug straight down, the disturbed snow would collapse inward and crush the boy. If they waited, the cold would take him. He looked at Abram. Abram knelt beside the hole and listened. He could hear the boy crying, a thin, muffled sound coming not from directly below, but from somewhere off to the left, which meant the child had fallen at an angle and slid sideways between the buried rocks. Jory stood behind him. The Cornishman's damaged hand was tucked inside his coat, useless, but his eyes moved over the snow surface the way they moved over a mine face, reading the terrain, calculating angles, estimating the weight and density of the material above the void. "Do not dig down," Jory said. "The sides will fail. Dig to the side, find the void, and enter it laterally. The rock underneath is your floor. The snow above is your ceiling. Do not disturb the ceiling." "I know," Abram said, and he did. He knew because Jory had taught him, over 4 days in the cleft shelter, how stone and snow and air behaved in enclosed spaces. He knew the snow above the void was acting as a roof, a bad roof, a dangerous roof, but a roof that would hold its own weight as long as no one pushed upward against it. He cut the entry from the side, 4 feet back from the hole, using the short axe to carve a horizontal tunnel through the compacted snow at ground level. He worked on his stomach, pushing snow behind him, feeling for the rock beneath with his free hand. The snow was dense, wind-packed, layered, heavy enough that each axe stroke moved only a few inches of material. His arms burned, his back cramped. The tunnel was dark and close, and smelled like frozen earth. Levi held a rope tied to Abram's ankle, ready to pull if the snow shifted. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it. 6 feet in, Abram's hand found empty space, the void. He widened the tunnel mouth enough to fit his shoulders through and crawled into a pocket between two buried boulders. A space roughly 4 feet long and 2 feet high, walled by granite on 2 sides and snow on the other 2. The Kepler boy sat at the far end, knees drawn to his chest, shaking so hard his teeth sounded like dice in a cup. "Do not move," Abram said. "Do not push against the walls. The snow above us is holding itself up. If we push it, it falls." "I cannot feel my feet," the boy said. "You will feel them again. I need you to crawl toward me. Slowly. Hands and knees. Do not lift your head above this line." Abram held his hand flat at the height of the granite ceiling. "Stay below the rock. The rock holds. The snow does not." The boy crawled. He reached Abram, and Abram took his arm and guided him into the tunnel, and they crawled out together. Abram backing up, pulling the boy by his coat. Levi pulling the rope, the snow ceiling groaning above them like a living thing deciding whether to fall. They emerged into daylight. The Kepler mother grabbed her son and held him so tightly the boy could not breathe, and for a moment no one cared about breathing because the alternative was a cairn beside Mace Bells. Jory watched from the trail. He had not entered the hole. He had not directed the rescue. He had said 2 sentences: "Do not dig down, dig to the side," and Abram had done the rest. That was the mentor's final teaching, not a skill, a silence. The knowledge that the student no longer needed instruction, only the courage to apply what he already knew. Haskell walked to Abram and looked at his snow-covered coat, his raw hands, his face smeared with frozen mud. He said, "You read the ground the way a miner reads a face." "I had a good teacher," Abram said. Jory heard it. He said nothing. He flexed his damaged hand inside his coat and felt the 2 stripped fingers protest, and he watched Abram receive the credit for knowledge that had lived in Cornish mines for 300 years, and he was satisfied. The satisfaction did not last. Orrin Platt made certain of that. The rescue had taken 20 minutes. Within an hour, Orrin was moving through the train with a different version of the story. He told people Abram had taken a reckless risk, that digging sideways was as likely to collapse the snow as digging down, and that Abram had been lucky, not skilled. He told people Abram was building a reputation on luck and other men's knowledge, and that when the luck ran out, someone would pay for it. Then he went further. He found Levi at the horse line and offered him wages. Real wages, $2 a week, paid in coin, to drive mules for the freight outfit. Levi was earning nothing from Abram. Abram had no money. The offer was transparent. Separate the boy from the man, weaken the operation, isolate Abram before they reach South Pass City. Levi came to Abram that evening and told him about the offer. $2 a week, Levi said. He was sitting against the wagon. They were sleeping under canvas now, the cleft shelter miles behind. And his voice was carefully neutral, the way a person sounds when they are trying not to let need influence a decision. "That is good money," Abram said. "It is money, which is more than I have now." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I would think about it." Abram was quiet for a while. The fire crackled. Martha was putting the children down. Jory was asleep with his hand resting on his chest, the bandage fresh, the fingers curled inward. "I cannot pay you $2 a week," Abram said. "I cannot pay you anything until the shop is running. I will not lie to you about that." "I know. But I can teach you wheel repair. I can teach you axle fitting, spoke shaving, felloe bending, hub boring. By spring, you will know enough to do journeyman work. By next winter, you will know enough to run a shop of your own if you choose." Orrin offers coin. Orrin offers wages. I offer a trade. Wages end when the man who pays them decides they end. A trade stays with you until your hands stop working. Abram held up his own hands, blistered, cracked, swollen at the knuckles. The hands of a man who had built a shelter from a broken wagon and 2 boulders and a candle flame. Orin pays men to do what he tells them, Abram said. I am asking you to learn what I know. There is a difference. And a quarter share in the shop? When the shop is built and running, yes, a quarter share. Levi looked at the fire. He was 15. He had buried his uncle on the Platte and walked west with nothing, and kept 2 horses alive through a blizzard, and pulled a man out of a snow tunnel by a rope tied to his ankle. He was not a child. He had not been a child since the grave. I will stay, Levi said. Abram nodded. He did not thank him, because thanking Levi would have made the arrangement feel like charity when it was partnership. He handed Levi a spoke shave and a piece of green hickory and said, Practice a straight pull, 6 inches. Stop when the shaving curls without breaking. Levi practiced until the fire died. The shavings piled around his boots like pale ribbons. 2 days later, the train reached the outskirts of South Pass City, and Jory Tregenza said goodbye. He said it without ceremony, because Cornishmen distrusted ceremony, and because the goodbye was not permanent. Jory was heading for the same town, to find the doctor who would examine his hand and deliver the verdict that Jory already knew. They stood at the edge of the trail where it widened toward the mining settlement. The Sweetwater mines were visible as scars on the hillsides, raw cuts in the earth where men had dug and blasted and hauled and broken themselves against rock for 2 years of gold that was already thinning. Jory unwrapped his hand. The 2 stripped fingers were healing, new skin forming at the edges, pink and thin and painful, but the grip was gone. He could close the hand halfway. He could not squeeze. I will not swing a sledge again, Jory said. It was not self-pity. It was inventory. You do not need to swing a sledge. You need to look at stone and tell me if it will hold. I told you I'm not a charity case. And I told you I am not offering charity. I am offering work. Jory reached into his coat and pulled out his miner's candle plate, a flat piece of tin with a spike for mounting a tallow candle, blackened from 30 years of underground work, bent at one corner where a falling rock had dented it. He held it out to Abram. You read air better now than you did 2 weeks ago, Jory said. This will remind you to keep reading it. Abram took the plate. It was warm from Jory's body. The tallow residue smelled like every mine and every kiln and every dark space where men had worked by candlelight and trusted the flame to tell them whether the air was safe. I will find you when the doctor is done, Jory said. He walked toward South Pass City. His coat was patched. His boots were heavy. His damaged hand was tucked against his chest. He did not turn around. Abram held the candle plate and watched him go, and for the first time since the axle broke, he felt the weight of what he had lost in order to learn what he now knew. Jory had paid for the roof vent rescue with 2 fingers and a career. The knowledge that saved Abram's family had cost Jory his trade. That exchange was not fair. Nothing on the frontier was fair, but the weight of it settled on Abram's chest like a stone, and he carried it forward into the town where his debt note waited, and his future depended on a creditor he had never met, and a set of tools that a man in a fox fur collar wanted to take from him. The trail dropped toward the settlement. Smoke rose from chimneys. The sound of hammers carried on cold air. Somewhere in those buildings, Milton Greaves held a piece of paper that said, Abram Vale owed $31. And somewhere between here and that office, Orrin Platt was already building the argument that Abram had arrived too late.